And if you're suggesting that Extinction Rebellion ought to operate in the way that the IEA operated, then I think that's absolutely right. But I mean, I'm not sure what argument you are making, because the whole point about the first past the post system is that it corrected itself. Because Liz Truss's government blew itself up because its policies were completely unsustainable and weren't going to work.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 151 for the 2nd of February 2023. I'm pessimistic. I'm not naturally a pessimistic person, but I'm pessimistic. Maybe I'm getting older, maybe I'm entering the whole world is going to hell phase of my life. Maybe I'm right to be pessimistic, maybe I'm not paying attention to the right things, but I'm pessimistic. In the US, I think that Trump has almost no chance of becoming the next president, but the chance of a new Trump is very real. Actually, it's worse. It could be a demagogue who has learnt from Trump, from his successes, but also from his failures, and someone who has also no regard for democracy. The economic inequality in the US is staggering, and it's destabilizing. Research indicates that 40% of Americans couldn't take the economic hit of an unexpected $400 expense. Think about that. A family relying on an insecure job done from home are one dropped laptop from spiralling down into poverty. That, or something like it, is 40% of the country. But what's crazier is that a huge proportion of that 40% will end up voting for Trump or whichever billionaire or billionaire's creature his protege turns out to be. And for sure, they won't do what is needed on climate change. The road we are headed down is leading us straight over a cliff, and the fact that a few of us might go over that cliff in an electric car drinking from a reusable cup, I really don't find that very reassuring. Then there's the whole hell in Ukraine. I could be optimistic that Ukraine will win. They could well, but they could well lose. But even if we get the best case scenario, what is that? I just can't see a scenario where Ukraine and Russia both go back to being relatively peaceful countries where people can live in something that looks vaguely like freedom. If the Ukrainians manage to liberate their country, and that's a big if, then it's very difficult to see how Russia doesn't either violently fall apart or get held together by an autocrat far more vicious in stamping out opposition even than Putin. Come to think of it, both of those could happen: ferocious autocracy and violent disintegration. If Russia wins, and they largely or totally subjugate Ukraine by force, that's hell for the Ukrainians, but don't dream that it'll stop there. Remember the slogan painted on all those Russian tanks and aircraft, Na Berlin, to Berlin. The ideology of the ruling elite in Russia is clear for anyone who wants to read it, and they're determined to rule over at least the whole of the former Soviet bloc, throw in Finland and Mongolia and a few more, and undermine democracy worldwide to weaken any potential challengers. Those two countries, Ukraine and Russia, are the source of too much of the world's food, especially for poor countries, for that to be something only of concern to those two countries. In China, the moderation that came from the unofficial rule since Mao in the 1960s that leaders should rule for only 10 years, that's been thrown out. And the cliche is that they think in much longer cycles than Westerners, but there's no doubt that they see taking over Taiwan on a very short timescale and intend to dominate the rest of Southeast Asia, not to mention Africa, and democracy simply isn't on their agenda. And much closer to us, Brexit is unrepairable. The UK Labour Party is miles ahead in the polls over there, but part of the reason for that is that they aren't dealing with that disaster. And when they get into power, they'll have no mandate to fix it. And outside London, Britain looks more and more like a failed state. We can laugh, there's not much else to do, but our nearest neighbour burning down their house isn't good for us. Countries don't benefit like companies from the failure of their competitors. It's not like Burger King getting a bump in their business because somebody found a rat in their Big Mac. It's more like your next door neighbour burning down their house. Do you really want to live near a burnt out site and all that that brings? You'll hear more about how difficult that is in the interview. And then there's Ireland. As some old Fianna Fáiler said in an interview once, "I'm hopeful, Marion, but I'm not optimistic." I know that a lot of countries would love to have our problems, but the housing situation is simply outrageous, and it's even more worrying that international investors are pumping in money in a way that indicates they believe it won't get any better. That amount of money is almost always smart money. We could get a government that is some combination of the old in a year or two and just suffer on, or we could get a radical new Sinn Féin administration. That might be the kick in the pants that the establishment needs, but my confidence in them standing up to vested interests isn't high. They talk the talk on climate change, for example, but they refuse to say what their carbon reduction targets would be because there exists no figure that is high enough to be realistic and low enough not to upset their rural vote. My worry is that they'd bottle it on the hard decisions and descend into a spiral of populism. It took Ireland 20 years, 20 lost years, to recover from the populism of the 1977 Fianna Fáil government. I'm sorry, I'm pessimistic. That's just it. In a moment, we'll have that interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, even if I'm depressing you guys. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, but it keeps the lights on and it pays for some of the smaller costs of making the podcast. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's a great morale booster. When we get a new patron on Patreon, it lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media, and you're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a Dublin bus ticket once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have John Rentoul. He's the chief political commentator with The Independent. When I say The Independent, I mean the British Independent newspaper, which for a time shared an owner with the Irish Independent, but the two are not connected other than that. He's also a visiting professor at King's College London, and his CV reads like a cliche of the British Empire. He was born in India, the son of an Anglican minister, went to Cambridge University, maybe on a steamboat, and also he's a distant relative of Sir Gervais Rentoul, who was the person who founded the 1922 committee of the Conservative Party, which is the one that's famous for dispatching various Conservative Party leaders. And John, to be honest, I'm impressed that you get any work done at all, because I see you've been on Twitter since 2008, and when I say on Twitter since then, I think you might not have taken a break, because you've done nearly 300,000 tweets, which works out at 54 a day. We can talk about your digital well-being some other time, but I'm interested in your views on the British electoral system, which I saw you tweeting about. Can you set that out just very briefly for the listeners?
Yeah, no, I supported the alternative vote in the referendum in 2011, which is now 11 years ago. Everyone's forgotten that we actually had a referendum on changing the voting system, and it was rejected by 68%. I mean, there are a lot of purists and Liberal Democrats who complain that it wasn't proportional representation. It was a preferential voting system that we were voting on at the time. But I mean, my view is that if it had been a proportional system that was on offer, it would have been defeated even more heavily, because the arguments weren't really about the merits of the system. They were about whether it was the right priority to change the voting system, and people just didn't understand why the change should be made. They assumed it was something to do with the coalition negotiations.
Yeah, I
and so
should
they
say,
voted
as
against
a
it.
as a background for Irish people who might not be as familiar with it, there for one parliament there was a coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, who are a party that actually get a significant vote in Britain, but have a very, very small number of seats because of the electoral system. One of their conditions for joining that coalition government, they tried to have essentially PR brought in. The Conservatives wouldn't allow that, and the compromise was that the Conservatives allowed a referendum on a slightly proportional system, this AV system, which it's like maybe the equivalent of Irish people being allowed to vote number 1 and number 2, but that's just it. That referendum was tossed out, and this is back in the news now because the new Labour Party leader, the now Labour Party, perhaps prospective next Prime Minister, has said that unlike the last time, the Labour Party will support the introduction of PR. How do you think that's going to go?
Oh no, he hasn't.
Oh, he hasn't.
No.
He has indicated that he might, or has not. He is less against it than they previously were, and they did campaign against that referendum the last time.
You can argue about that, William. I mean, Tony Blair pretended to be in favour of change at one point.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about, I mean, Keir Starmer has a party which is very much in favour of PR, but he himself has not committed to doing anything about it. And once if the Labour Party wins the next election, if he becomes Prime Minister, then the incentive to change the system under which it has just won is going to recede quite quickly, and I suspect that will happen again.
I suspect that you're correct. It is notoriously difficult to persuade a government to change the electoral system because they won under the existing one and that works for them, and they may well suspect that any change would mean that they would be less likely to win. But
exactly.
I want to look more at the principle of the thing than at the nitty gritty, because on this podcast we have an intelligent listenership. They're very engaged with ideas, and the tweeting that I saw you doing seemed to be very, very skeptical of PR, and you say you voted for this AV system, but tell me all of the skepticism that you have.
Well, I'm opposed to proportional representation in principle, William. I mean, I think it gives disproportionate power to small parties, and I prefer a single-member constituency-based system.
Define disproportionate.
Well, because by definition, if a party holds the balance of power in a hung parliament, then it doesn't matter how many votes it got. It has equal power to a party which has got a lot more support. So
that's something that happens in your first past the post system. I'm not aware of that happening in any other place.
Yes, but it's more likely to happen under a proportional system.
For
especially
example,
if it leads. Well, for example, I mean, you've got Israel at the moment is a very good advertisement for the defects of a strictly proportional system, where you have some really quite remarkable characters exercising disproportionate influence over the formation of that government, disproportionate in relation to the level of support that they have in the country, and that is my objection in principle to proportionality, because I mean people confuse.
Pause that for a moment, because I think that's a very flawed argument. Because up in front of me, I've got the Wikipedia page of what's called the Democracy Index. I've mentioned this before on the podcast. The Economist magazine in your hometown, these days anyway, ranks every country in the world, and it's a very transparent system. They ask dozens and dozens of basically yes/no questions, and you get a point if you get a yes, you don't get a point if you get a no, on the different aspects that should be present in a democracy. And first of all, I should say, Ireland does considerably better at number 7 ranked in the world than the UK does. The UK is just barely inside the line of being listed as a full democracy, just above Mauritius.
Oh, I think that's outrageous.
Absolutely outrageous. Well, that's a British magazine that does that.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I don't agree with it. To suggest that the United Kingdom is not democratic, I think.
No. Hold on a second. It says that it lists the United Kingdom as a full democracy. So that is reasonable, I think.
Just.
But only just. And looking at the top 10, every single country listed there has PR. And to choose one country, Israel, where you're absolutely correct, but I think for very, very special reasons, certain minorities have an incredible amount of power over a larger proportion of the population that probably would not be sympathetic to the policies that they're pursuing. But that's true. But I want to look at the basic principle of this. And the principle that I would start from is that most countries in the world and all advanced democracies are parliamentary systems. They're parliamentary democracies, they would not be listed with executive presidents in general. That's the trend. And therefore you have to elect a parliament which is going to be very powerful. And I would say that a reasonable approach would be to say that the parliament, the spread of representatives in the parliament should reflect the spread of the votes of the voters. And that's a principle that you can agree with or disagree with. But what I'm wondering is...
Yeah, I disagree with it.
Oh, okay, yeah, but I'm wondering what, rather than, finding a negative example of where that doesn't work so well, or rather than picking holes in something, what's your generalized principle for how the parliament should be populated?
Well, my generalized principle is that elections are about making a decision. They're not about representation. You're not aiming to represent every 57 varieties of public opinion. You're aiming to make a decision about the government of a country. And so proportionality gets in the way of that, in my view, because it gives disproportionate.
You are going to the practical, and we will talk about the practical in a minute. But I want to hear the principle. I can articulate very clearly a principle that the parliament should be populated as far as is practical to represent the votes of the people. What's the principle? What's the principle of how the parliament should be populated?
Yeah, and my principle is that elections are about making a decision. And the parliament should be populated in such a way as to make a decision about how the country should be governed. And I think the first past the post system is a good way of doing that. I'm not particularly opposed to proportional representation. I'm just saying it's got drawbacks. And obviously the Economist is going to rank highly countries that have proportional representation because it has a bias towards proportionality being a good and democratic thing in its survey design. So, but in my view, there's nothing democratic about proportionality itself. I think true democracy comes from the ability to make decisions, and I think elections should be judged on that basis.
Okay. Looking at the countries and avoiding extreme examples and whatever, but looking at the countries that score highly in the world, that not only are democratic, but are also, with the Human Development Index score highly, that are wealthy countries and so forth. And looking at those, it does seem that there is a strong parallel with those. And also, the one thing that is very notable there, as you say about making a decision, decisions are not binary. Or at least they're usually not binary.
That's the whole point, William.
Why?
That is the whole point about democracy and life, is that decisions in the end are binary. You can't. This is the thing about the wasted vote argument. People say, "Oh, well, I want my vote to count." Your vote doesn't count if you don't vote for the winning side. That applies in a proportional system just as much as a first past the post system.
Okay.
Because in the end, for example, in this country, we have a choice at the next election, probably, between a government led by Keir Starmer or a government led by Rishi Sunak. Yeah. In Ireland, you have a choice between a government led by Leo Varadkar or one by Mr. Martin. Although, obviously, Sinn Féin complicates the picture.
More likely Mary Lou McDonald. But anyway, yes, go on.
Well, yeah, but it comes down to a binary choice. So the idea of proportionality, I think, is a distraction.
Okay, so first of all, you say it comes down to a binary choice. I'm not sure that it does, because I think in the UK, a startling proportion of the electorate have no choice at all. And I just ran some figures while I was preparing for this. And I was looking at UK elections since World War II, which is really the current political era going back prior to World War II. You're looking at a different country, essentially. And in that period, there was one extraordinary standout election in 1997 where there was a swing of 10.2%. That's to say 10.2% of the voters swung from one party to another. In this case, from the Conservatives to Labour, largely, although there would have been smaller differences on the side.
I remember it well.
Yes. That was by a wide margin the biggest swing in modern British politics. The next biggest was 5.3%, which was in 1979 in favour of Margaret Thatcher when she was first elected. The next biggest after that was 5.1% to David Cameron in 2010.
David Cameron.
And all of the other elections. So that's just 3 elections, one of them with a swing of over 10%, 2 of them with a swing of over 5%. All of the other elections have had swings of less than 5%. And if you look at the majorities in constituencies, in the 632 constituencies in Britain, the great majority of them are invulnerable. The sitting MP is invulnerable to a swing of the Margaret Thatcher side. So that's like a normal election with a very, very large swing. 405 of the 632 British MPs are completely invulnerable. Their majorities are so big that they're invulnerable to that. And even if you take the absolutely extraordinary 1997 election, which was a complete outlier, it was literally a once-in-a-lifetime size swing. 295 MPs, that's almost half, 47% of all MPs in the Parliament, are invulnerable to that. That's to say that their majority is more than 20.4%. Of the votes cast.
Yes.
So when a British person goes to vote, there's only about a 50-50 shot that there is any chance whatsoever that their MP will be unseated, that the seat will change hands. And if you're looking in what you might call normal elections, it's probably only about less than a 1/3 chance. So one of my difficulties with that system is that you say people have a choice. Actually, they don't have a choice. And you can come up with all sorts of very large, significant electorates, such as, for example, 1 million Green Party voters in Britain get a sum total of 1 MP. And actually,
and
I think that's...
conversely, the SNP get overrepresented in relation to
Sinn Féin get 1 MP for every 26,000 votes they get. The Green Party, British Green Party, gets 1 MP for every 1 million votes they get. But in fact, that's understating it, because what's happening there is that a great majority of the people, I suspect, who might vote for the Green Party are very well aware that if they vote for the Green Party, their vote will be wasted in the sense that somebody who it might go to electing somebody who they really don't like as opposed to somebody who they quite dislike. And they are then essentially forced to choose between wasting their vote or voting for somebody who they don't really want to vote for. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. I think that is incredibly dangerous.
It's not.
Because hold on for a second. You have seen really quite startlingly illegal acts by groups like Extinction Rebellion, and
who've just given up.
Who have?
Unpopular.
But we will see. We will see how that plays out. But my point is that where somebody has a very deeply held conviction, no doubt including Extinction Rebellion, and where they can absolutely correctly say that they have zero democratic input, it's very difficult to persuade them that they then should obey the laws that they cannot contribute to making.
No, I think that's a terrible argument. You can't say that, because there are lots of people in Ireland who vote, who may feel passionately in favour of a particular cause and yet fail to elect a TD who represents their view in their constituency. I mean,
it's profoundly unlikely. That's profoundly unlikely because if they, for example, support the Green Party, I'll use that as an example of a small party. Even if they support the Green Party in a constituency where there is no chance of the Green Party getting elected, they can absolutely safely vote, number one, for the Green Party, and number two, for their next most preferred party. So theoretically, in the British context, they could then vote one Green, two Labour, and they could then at least say that they're
feel better.
Yes, and that's incredibly important. Faith in democracy is a critical part of democracy.
Well, that is one reason why I supported the alternative vote in the referendum that we had in 2011, because it allowed preferential voting. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, my fellow country folk didn't agree with me, and they thought they had all sorts of objections to that system. And actually, what it boiled down to was that they didn't understand it, mm-hmm. which I think is disappointing, because it's pretty straightforward. However, you have to work with what you've got. And obviously there's an expressive value in being able to put your first preference first, but that doesn't mean that you're then justified in taking to violence if you don't get what you want at the ballot box.
No, but we live in this reality, on this world, with these human beings, and people who feel that they are at the sharp end of a serious and continuing grievance and have no democratic outlet. It is just a reality that they are likely to go into lawbreaking.
But William, but that would apply to someone who voted Green first preference in a constituency where they failed to elect a Green. They could still feel that this is somehow unfair and that the universe was conspiring against them.
No. One thing could happen in that they could see that there is a large, I think, element, not completely, but a large element of validity to the swings and roundabouts argument. So whereby somebody who in a constituency where they failed to elect a Green would be able to say, well, in another constituency a Green was elected and somebody else was failed to be elected, and on the whole the Green voters are represented like that.
Yeah.
But if you organise the system, that massive parties, and I think, I don't have the figure in front of me, but it was something in the region of 4 million votes for UKIP, didn't elect a single MP. That is extraordinarily undemocratic. So, in other words, almost the population of Ireland.
It's not undemocratic. It is unrepresentative, which is a different thing.
And can I tell you a practical? Can I tell you a practical problem with that? Because one thing that, and I'm going to give you, I will condescend to give you a short history, a piece of history from Ireland, because I think actually many Irish people are not aware of this. On the 9th of March 1932. Nothing happened. And the nothing that happened resulted in Ireland remaining a democracy, because what had happened was there was an election in which for the first time Fianna Fáil essentially won the election. They had previously, up to shortly before that, they had boycotted the entire democratic system for the 10 years following the Civil War. And into Leinster House walked people who had ordered the deaths of the friends of other people in Leinster House. One extraordinary example, Erskine Childers was shot for possessing weapons during an emergency. The death penalty was available and used in his case. The weapon he was caught in possession of was a decorative pearl-handled pistol, which had been given to him by Michael Collins, a minister in the government that signed his death warrant. So there was unbelievable bitterness. The Fianna Fáil deputies walking into Leinster House on that day, many of them had concealed revolvers in their pockets because they were entirely unsure whether they would be allowed to take into government, or because the previous government still controlled the police and the army and so forth. It was very, a very close run thing. There could have been a coup.
Yeah.
But the people who had ordered the execution of Erskine Childers handed power over to his comrades, because that system pulls towards the centre. If you are in a proportional system, you can't win without the centre. And in Britain, you can. That is disastrously bad. No, it's absolutely not true. No, if you just organise a reasonably large minority, if you organise them well enough and your opposition is sufficiently disorganised, you can take over. And an highly organised minority can be a very dangerous thing. And I don't know your views on Brexit, but I would suggest not only the extremism of Brexit, but the extreme
that was a highly
extreme
organised majority,
version.
actually, William. But
No, you're completely incorrect. You're completely incorrect. There was no majority ever for Britain leaving the single market and Britain being as isolated as it is from the EU. There was never any majority. And in fact, everyone from Daniel Hannan to Nigel Farage explicitly said that there was no chance that Brexit would go that far. Clearly, they were being economic.
Well, different people said different things, but yes.
But the Brexit leaders said that there was no chance that Britain would leave the single market, and then organised to do exactly that because they had control not of a majority, but of the largest minority. There was a spectrum of views. There was a spectrum of views in Britain.
A general election
in Britain, but in Britain there
was
was a spectrum of views on Brexit, and there is no way in hell that it would have been possible to marshal a majority in favour of the extremity of Brexit that was implemented.
I'm not sure that's,
but I don't want
I'm
to
not sure that's true.
Well, then one would question why the Brexit leaders were as economical with their plans as, at least in public, as they were.
I think the Conservatives plus UKIP had the support of 50% of the electorate. I admit it didn't.
But yes, but hold on for a second. Conservatives, including people like Anna Soubry.
Yes.
And so people supporting what happened most certainly did not have a majority.
Except they probably. That's very difficult to argue as to what would have been possible in the end. But the alleged majority you're talking about includes people like Anna Soubry and that whole generation of Tory MPs that essentially were booted out or forced out of the party by Boris Johnson in the run-up to the 2019 election. But that's true.
I don't. Yes. So I think that my point stands very strongly there, that it would never have been possible to organise a majority in favour of what happened. But I don't want to refight the Brexit battle.
In a proportional system in the UK, yes, I think that is probably true. But you can never be sure about these things.
You can. Oh yes, you can. Oh yes, you can, because you can do it democratically. And I want to look at a couple of other things, because in the system that you're dealing with, you have, and there will always be anomalies in every system, but the size of the anomalies are simply gigantic, and in some cases, the anomaly is bigger than anything else. So first of all, I mentioned the problem of MPs with gigantic majorities, where the largest one is, I think, don't have it to hand, but the MP with the largest vote has 80%. Hold on a second. No, but what about the other end of the end? No, the other end of that scale. You have MPs being elected with tiny proportions of the vote in their constituency because they're just very lucky that the vote is very split. And you have in one case in South Belfast, obviously not in Britain, but it's under that system. You have SDLP MP being elected with less than a quarter of the vote. An MP, a solitary sole one MP per constituency MP, can't possibly have any legitimacy when they're getting less than a quarter of the vote, and when three quarters of the people or more then vote for somebody else. That's
a reason why I supported the alternative vote of preferential voting. But it doesn't invalidate the system. And I mean, you quote all these. For example, then how do you reconcile that with Scotland? Even under an AV system, the Scottish National Party would win basically every single seat in Scotland. Yes, as they have done, which I don't like. Perhaps I should support proportional representation in Scotland and not the rest of the UK.
But my point is this. Yeah, okay, go ahead. You go first.
So your point about safe seats. I mean, if you look at the number of MPs or TDs who actually change from election to election in Ireland, it's probably about the same as in the UK. I mean, individual votes can never have an influence on the outcome of any individual election. I mean,
Dick Spring survived by 4 votes.
What?
Dick Spring, the then leader of the Labour Party, held his seat by 4 votes. But that's not
unusual, isn't it?
No. So first of all, it is obviously silly to say that it's not democratic or it's not sufficiently democratic if it's not my one individual vote that turns the election. That is
Yeah.
an exceptionally unusual thing to happen, and that's not a requirement for a democratic system. My point is,
absolutely.
my point is that where there is a movement of people, and where you have not only significantly large movements of people, 1 million people voting for the Green Party, 4 million people voting for UKIP or whatever, where you have those large movements, and for example, you have movements that are equal to the greatest electoral swing that has happened in the UK in living memory, and where half of the seats in the Parliament are invulnerable to being changed even by that size of a swing, that's a different point. And I just want to go back on one thing you said, that in Ireland, most of the seats don't change at every election. Most of the TDs don't change at every election. That's not the correct metric, because almost every constituency sees some change at every election. And in a constituency, for example, in a
constituency, remain the same. I mean, the changes are usually for the fourth or fifth.
Yes, but the fight then is for the party that already has 1 or 2 TDs elected in a 5-seater to see if they can get a third to scrape into the last seat, or for a smaller party to see can they defeat the larger party and get in
but the
to the
first
last
or
seat.
second TDs are still just as safe as an MP in a safe seat in the UK. So, I mean,
but their party can do better. And in fact, you will find that in reality, a few weeks before the election, all of those seats where they have, people who are in the first or second seat, those people will be getting a call from their party leader saying that if you want a cabinet seat, you better make sure that Johnny down the ticket from you gets elected. That's what your cabinet seat is based on. So no soft peddling. And so they're highly motivated. But my point is that they are completely unresponsive to the voters and safe.
I just don't think that's true, though, William. I mean, because the one thing we know about MPs in the UK is that they're incredibly responsive to the voters. No matter how safe their seat, they still think they're going to lose it at the next election, and work incredibly hard to try and keep it.
Okay, can I give you a completely different reason why I think it's better? And it's this. It is because it is an antidote to extremism. Where you need a majority, you are highly you're highly proportionate. I agree with the point on disproportionate power, and I will come to that in a moment. But my point is that where you have someone who can always either win a seat or win another seat by being nice to the supporters of other parties, that has the generalized effect of pulling politics towards the centre. And
exactly what happens under first past the post as well.
That doesn't seem to be the case in the US.
Appealing to the soft voters of the other side.
No, well, that doesn't seem to be what's happening in the US, and it doesn't seem to be what's happening in Britain, both of whom notably are tending towards extremism in recent years.
I don't accept that about the UK. I mean, the US is a peculiar case because of the phenomenon of Trump, but that doesn't apply in the UK. I mean, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are both centrists competing for the same votes at the next election.
But they are also competing is perhaps the wrong word, but they are battling perhaps with extremists in their own party. And you talk now about Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. A very short time ago, we had Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and the degree of extremism was much greater. But the point, we are lucky, perhaps, both of us, to live in countries that now, where, large-scale political violence seems to be completely off the agenda. But we're not, that's not the case everywhere. And it is not so far away in geography or in history from having that problem. And, I've talked about what happened in Ireland in the 1930s. What happened in many countries in continental Europe, and not a little bit in Britain in the 1930s, was you had street gangs of and it's hard to say extremists when they between them make up a large majority of the electorate, battling each other out and having riots and having armed battles in the streets. And I'm not talking about the war, I'm talking about the pre-war period when you had fascist and communist militias in various countries in Europe.
Yeah.
Ireland, and to a large extent Britain, escaped that. And my point is that Ireland, uniquely amongst the countries that came to independence in the 1920s, those peripheral countries, Greece, Portugal, those type of countries, all had democracy and lost it. And what happened differently in Ireland was that need to get the number 3 or 4 or 5 vote from your embittered opponent, because that would make the difference between you and the other fellow in your party getting the seat. So it is always biased towards reconciliation, which is the opposite of the system that happens in this first past the post system. And I would, I'd make the point that
I really don't agree.
Well,
violence and extremism are the questions of politics. They're not really affected by the design of electoral systems. The UK avoided that kind of violence in the pre-war period, and they didn't.
No, they didn't.
Well, we didn't have a civil war. It wasn't a general strike.
You're correct. It's a general strike. There wasn't a civil war. So it avoided sliding into dictatorship, but it didn't avoid political violence. But the point is that the system shapes the politics. And you can shape the politics.
I totally disagree. I think the politics comes first and the system is entirely secondary. I just don't think there's any necessary connection between a political system and outcomes, because we've already discussed Israel, but you can go to other countries and other systems where in Austria you had the far right took the presidency. And so on. These are political questions decided by political forces rather than the design of voting systems.
I don't think Austria took the far right. They came close but didn't quite take the presidency. In Austria, you may have a different view on Sinn Féin to many of the listeners, but there is another advantage there, and I think the system does influence the politics, because the bottom line was that Sinn Féin was essentially dragged kicking and screaming into politics. And politics is what gave us the ceasefires and the lure of actually getting something done, making actual changes. And the possibility of that is what has dragged Sinn Féin into being, albeit a radical left to a certain degree, but certainly mainstream political party.
Yes,
and there is nobody now.
There is
yes, but my point is, and I'm not making a comparison between Extinction Rebellion and Sinn Féin. I'm just making the point of distinction between parliamentary and extra-parliamentary politics and action.
Yeah,
Extinction Rebellion is going in the opposite direction, because there's 1 million people who vote for the Green Party in the UK, and there's probably several million more who would have, only they were bullied out of doing it. And there's probably more again who would, with that example, in the next government, vote for the Green Party. So my point is that what the system that you're working with seems to be essentially a closed shop whereby politicians pull up the ladder after them and say, okay, our ideas are the ones that are allowed. We build the Overton window, and we're going to have the system set up so as that no other ideas can come into the system. And that is, and allow me to give you another danger. So it is obvious that, for example, Extinction Rebellion is not making an impact in powerful circles. But where you have still very, very small, I would say much smaller than the broader environmentalist movement, where you have a very small political interest group like the Institute for Economic Affairs, who are very clever and skillful and adept at placing their people into the right positions in that closed shop, you can have a tiny stream of opinion being enormously powerful beyond its size. And Liz Truss was elected. Liz Truss became the Prime Minister. Kwasi Kwarteng and various others who she appointed were all from this one particular so-called think tank. And it is visible because it was such a catastrophe, but this has happened
I'm not sure what point you're
in other
making
cases.
There,
My point is that if someone is successful at hijacking that system, you can have a small group who are unbelievably powerful, far and away beyond their numbers, which seems to be a complaint that you're making of PR. Liz Truss could never ever have become Prime Minister under a PR system in Britain.
Well, that's simply not. You can't say that. You just don't know how the votes would fall out and how the parties would organise themselves. I mean, extraordinary things happen in PR systems. But I mean, if you're saying that
Okay,
Extinction
well then
Rebellion ought to
just
organise,
just deal with the point then that the IEA, Institute for Economic Affairs, who were essentially the authors of Liz Truss's the Kamikaze budget, they were a highly skilled, very minority group who managed to acquire extraordinary power.
no, I don't think that's true. I mean, actually, a lot of what they said had quite wide support. And if you're suggesting that Extinction Rebellion ought to operate in the way that the IEA operated, then I think that's absolutely right. But I mean, I'm not sure what argument you are making, because the whole point about the first past the post system is that it corrected itself. Because Liz Truss's government blew itself up because its policies were completely unsustainable and weren't going to work. So
wouldn't it be better not to have tried them in the first place if they're so bad?
Well, of course, it would have been much better not to have tried, but it would have been much better not to have tried Jeremy Corbyn's politics as well, in my personal opinion. But I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is another example of how the existing party system can be won by organised political campaigning of a minority, of what starts off as a minority persuasion, but can actually gain quite a lot of influence through the system. I mean, there are all sorts of examples of how that happens in first past the vote systems.
And would you not agree that the closeness that more TDs in the case of Ireland feel to the electorate essentially insulates countries that have PR from that?
But because they feel closer to their voters than MPs do in first past the post systems.
Than 430 MPs who have essentially zero chance of being unseated at the next election.
No, but I've explained they don't feel like that. They actually feel very accountable to their constituents, and they always think they're going to lose.
But they're
their
not.
Seats, even if they are safe.
Yes, but you're just saying that the system relies on lunacy. Then that they are failing to perceive the fact that they have zero chance of losing their seat.
No, they don't have a zero chance. They always
430 MPs would not be unseated by the greatest swing in the vote that has happened in living memory.
Then along comes an even greater swing. I mean, people can't.
No, it doesn't.
You can never be completely dogmatic about these things. And actually, the British tradition is, puts a huge store on the constituency link, and MPs are very sensitive to that. I mean, if not because their seat is unsafe, because they could be under threat of deselection from their parties, and so on. I mean, there are lots of ways in which democratic accountability can work.
That may be the case. I want to, I'm sure you know about it, but I will tell the Irish listeners, 1951 general election. The Labour Party not only got the most votes in that election.
Always a sore point, this one.
No.
I'm a Labour Party supporter.
Yeah, okay, yes, but it goes way more than that. The Labour Party got the most votes of any party in any election ever up to 1992, so in 1951. So given that there was a big jump in the population between 1951 and 1992, that was an enormous achievement. And the Labour Party lost the election. Not only did they lose the election, the Conservative Party won the election with an overall majority. Those type of anomalies seriously undermine faith in democracy, don't they?
No, they don't. I mean, where were the people taking to the streets after that election? People accept the rules of the game, and the rules of the electoral system are that you elect MPs in constituencies, they form a government in the House of Commons, and everybody understands the rules and accepts the outcome, even if there are occasional situations like that. Because there was the opposite situation in February 1974 when the Conservatives got more votes than Labour, and yet Harold Wilson formed the government after that. I mean, because
he formed a government but didn't have a majority
of the system. What?
He formed a government but didn't have a majority.
Yeah, but it was still just as unfair in your characterisation that the Conservatives won more votes. But that's making a fetish of representation and strict mathematical representation. There are all sorts of reasons why people would have voted in that election in different constituencies, and they do. You've pointed out that in safe seats it's not actually worth going out to vote. So if you're in sometimes Conservative and Labour voters behave differently in safe in safe and marginal seats, and that's going to distort the national totals. But that doesn't mean that I mean, if you change the system, then fine, then the national total will count. But then people will behave differently in the polling stations, and probably vote differently. And who knows? They might even have voted for the Tories in 1951.
They might have, but do you not think that there's a principle there that it is useful to allow people to express, to vote?
I don't think representation and proportionality are the most important principles in deciding elections. I think elections are about making a decision.
But let me put it to you that most voters don't really know the exact position of their party on a whole range of more technical policies. They vote for that party. They vote for that party because they generally trust that that party will make better decisions than the party that they're not voting for. And it may not be the case. In fact, it certainly wasn't the case when the system that you advocate was first evolved. I don't think it could even be said to have been designed. It was then people voting for individuals whom they most likely knew personally.
Yeah.
But now most voters in the UK don't actually know the name of their MP and the main rival candidate. They are voting for the brand of the party.
Yes.
And to me, that seems to invalidate what you're saying, because if what they are doing in reality is voting for the brand of their party, and or perhaps voting for another party that they hope they can tolerate because they are afraid to vote for the party that they support, doesn't that make a nonsense of this thing of saying that they are being then represented by this other MP who wins, and the fact that their vote counts for nothing is not problematic?
I'm not sure why that should be. No, because yes, obviously people vote for parties. People don't know a lot about the detailed policy positions.
But address the issue that they're voting for the brand of the party, and when that is not the way that the votes are counted, that's a problem.
Well, they're counted. No, but they are counted that way in individual constituencies, and I think the huge advantage of first past the post is that you do have clarity about the two main parties at least. Whereas if you have a proportional system, you're voting for a party brand, but you have no control over what happens after the votes are cast, because then the parties go into coalition negotiations, which have very little accountability to the voters, and then
they do the next election
for one thing, and they end up with something completely different.
They can punish the party at the next election if they were unfaithful to their brand or to the message that they gave out, or their manifesto, if that's what they've based their vote on. So there's a live debate, and there's a live debate in the UK about Britain specifically, about the Westminster voting system and whether it should be changed to a PR system. Why do you think that there's no debate at all in Scotland about changing the Scottish Parliament to a first past the post system?
The answer to that question is because the system that they have suits the SNP government in Edinburgh, so they're very happy with it. The SNP couldn't have gained control of the Scottish Parliament, I don't think, if they hadn't had a system of that kind. I mean, the system
exactly they couldn't have got a foothold. And the foothold has displayed that they have the support of something in the region of 50% of the population. So that's
45% plus the Greens usually.
Yes, but you see how that is gatekeeping an idea that does have support, or that has the potential to build support. And I think sticking a cork in that kettle in the hope of preventing it from boiling is not a wise political move. But John Rentoul, chief political commentator of the London Independent, I should say, thank you very much for talking to me.
It's been my pleasure, William. Thanks very much.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. While you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow John Rentoul at John Rentoul, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, it covers the costs of keeping the podcast going. If you can throw in €1 or €2 every month, we would really appreciate that. Please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The next podcast will have the former president of Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party. That'll be up on the 16th of February. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.